Under the frozen skies of Montana, a former Navy SEAL named Ethan Cole trudged down an empty roadside, his breath a ghost in the winter air. Beside him padded his loyal German shepherd Shadow, the only comrade left from a past he tried to forget. Buried half in the snow, Ethan found a black briefcase. Inside, neat stacks of cash, more than $100,000. Enough to save his mother, dying of cancer. He knelt there, torn between love and honor, the wind whispering the choice he didn't want to make. The next morning, he walked into a glass tower and returned it to its owner, billionaire Richard Kane. When Kane opened the case and saw every dollar still there, he was speechless. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And if you still believe integrity has a price worth paying, tap subscribe. The Montana plains slept beneath a sheet of snow, pale and endless, the wind whispering like ghosts over the frozen highway. Ethan Cole trudged along the roadside with his German shepherd, Shadow, his boots crunching against the ice-crusted gravel. At 34, Ethan carried the posture of a soldier who'd been through too many storms, broad-shouldered, jawline sharp but tired, a faint scar tracing from his temple to the edge of his beard. His dark brown hair was cropped short, military style, yet unkempt now, and his eyes, steel gray, held that distant look of a man who'd seen too much and slept too little. Once a Navy SEAL, Ethan had led men through fire and dust, but Bozeman, Montana, had no wars left to fight. His discharge 2 years ago had come with a limp he hid well and a silence he couldn't. Beside him, Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat and intelligent amber eyes, walked alert but calm, his breath steaming in the cold air. Shadow had once been a service dog, trained to detect explosives, and had saved Ethan's life during a blast that ended his military career. Since then, the two had become inseparable, brothers in exile. Ethan's hands were red and raw beneath torn gloves, his breath fogging with every exhale. The town behind him had rejected him again, another security job turned down. They said he was overqualified, but Ethan knew what that really meant. Damaged goods. His mother, Margaret Cole, 62 and frail from cancer treatments, waited at home in a wooden cabin whose walls creaked like old bones. The medicine shelf was nearly empty. He could still hear her voice that morning, light and hopeful despite the pain. "Don't worry, Ethan. God's got a plan for us." He'd smiled for her sake, but inside he didn't believe in plans anymore. As the wind howled through the barren road, something black glimmered beneath the snowbank, a metal corner half buried. Ethan stopped. Shadow sniffed, tail low, curious. Ethan knelt, brushed off the frost, and uncovered a black leather briefcase, heavy, locked, but the latch cracked open from the fall. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, under the gray morning light, neat stacks of $100 bills gleamed. Clean, crisp, untouched. He blinked, counted quickly. 10 bundles, maybe more, at least $100,000. The sight struck him like a wave. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. With that money, his mother could have every treatment she needed. They could fix the roof, pay the debts, start over. His fingers trembled as he touched the bills, real, cold, smelling faintly of ink and plastic. But something else caught his eye. Beneath the final stack lay a business card, white with embossed letters. Richard Kane, Kane Holdings. Ethan exhaled slowly. He'd heard the name. Kane was a billionaire industrialist who owned half the land north of Bozeman, a man whose face appeared on magazine covers and whose company donated millions. For a moment, Ethan stared into the horizon, the snow reflecting light so bright it made his eyes sting. The choice pressed against him like the cold itself. His mother's face flashed before him, thin, pale, her hands shaking as she reached for his. He imagined her smile if he told her the treatments were paid for. He imagined her alive next spring. Then he imagined her eyes when she realized he'd stolen to save her. He clenched his jaw, whispering into the wind, "If I take it, I lose the last part of me she still believes in." Shadow gave a low whine, leaning his head against Ethan's shoulder as if understanding. Ethan closed the case, tightened the broken latch, and stood. The snow kept falling, soft but endless. He looked down the empty road toward Bozeman. His breath came out in a sigh that turned to mist. He began walking back toward town, the briefcase heavy in his grip, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. He didn't know what returning it would bring. Probably nothing. But it was the only way he could still face his mother's eyes when he got home. And as Shadow trotted beside him, their footprints stretching behind like a fading promise, Ethan whispered to himself, "Sometimes the right thing doesn't feed you, it just keeps you human." Snow whipped across the empty streets of Bozeman as Ethan Cole trudged through the storm, the black briefcase heavy in his hand. 5 miles through sleet and biting wind. His breath burned, his thighs ached, but he didn't stop. He moved like a man on a mission, every step a defiance of the easy way out. His coat was too thin for this weather, an old military parka faded from years of wear, and his boots leaked at the seams. Shadow trotted silently beside him, fur dusted white, his amber eyes fixed ahead, as if guiding his master toward something inevitable. By the time they reached downtown, the world had turned to glass and steel. The Kane Holdings Tower rose like a black monolith, its mirrored surface slicing into the gray sky. Ethan paused at the entrance, snow dripping from his shoulders, and glanced at his reflection in the glass doors. A soldier turned stranger. He almost laughed at how out of place he looked among men in tailored suits and women in heels rushing through the revolving doors. Inside, the marble floor gleamed, too clean, too polished. The heat from the lobby blasted his face like a different world's air. Shadow stayed by the entrance, obedient, while Ethan approached the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and immaculate nails, looked up and froze for a second, her polite smile wavering. Ethan's face was rugged, his beard untrimmed, his hair damp from melted snow, and his eyes, those gray soldier's eyes, were steady but distant. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, voice brittle. Ethan placed the briefcase gently on the counter. "I believe this belongs to Mr. Richard Kane." Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. "Do you have an appointment?" He shook his head. "No. Just tell him I came to return something important." The woman blinked, torn between suspicion and curiosity. "May I ask your name?" "Ethan Cole." When she typed it in, nothing came up. Her gaze darted toward the security guard, a thick man with a badge and the kind of eyes that had seen too many liars. The guard walked over, studying Ethan from head to toe, his voice low and wary. "You from the street, buddy? We don't take donations here." Ethan's lips pressed into a line. "Neither do I." He pushed the briefcase toward the receptionist. "You can check the ID inside." It's Richard Kane's. The tension hung for a few seconds before the receptionist picked up her phone. Her tone changed as she murmured into the receiver, words like urgent and claims he found something. The lobby went silent. 10 long minutes later, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Richard Kane stepped out. He was tall, maybe 60, with a presence that filled the space before his words did. His black tailored suit fit perfectly across a lean frame. His silver hair was combed back, his face pale, carved with lines of control and fatigue. But it was his eyes, cold blue, sharp as fractured ice, that drew every gaze. Those were the eyes of a man used to being obeyed. Ethan recognized the type instantly. Commanders in suits instead of uniforms. Men who conquered boardrooms instead of battlefields. Kane stopped a few feet away, his attention fixed on the briefcase. "Where did you find this?" "By the road, east of the city," Ethan said. "Half buried in snow." Kane opened it slowly. The air seemed to still as he lifted the lid. Neat rows of $100 bills gleamed under the fluorescent light. Not a single one missing. The older man's jaw tightened. For a second, something human flickered in his face. Relief, disbelief, maybe even guilt. He closed the case, looking at Ethan. "You know, most people wouldn't have brought this back." Ethan's voice was hoarse from the cold. "I've lost too much already. I'm not about to lose my honor, too." That line hit something deep in Kane. His gaze softened, only slightly, but enough to reveal a shadow of pain behind the ice. He studied Ethan more closely. The rigid posture, the soldier's calm, the faint limp. "You served," he said quietly. "Yes, sir. Navy SEAL, Team 6 discharged last year." A rare smile crossed Kane's lips, small, genuine, gone in an instant. "That explains it." He extended a hand. "Richard Kane." Ethan hesitated, then shook it. The billionaire's grip was strong but cold. "You did the right thing, Mr. Cole. Not many do anymore." Ethan nodded once, ready to leave. Just wanted to make sure it found its way back. But as he turned to go, Kane's voice stopped him. "Wait." Ethan looked back. Kane's eyes had softened with something that almost resembled respect. "I could use a man like you. Someone who still believes in doing what's right, even when it costs something." Ethan frowned. "Doing what exactly?" Kane's mouth curved slightly. "Come back tomorrow morning. I'll tell you then." The elevator doors closed behind him, leaving Ethan standing alone in the lobby with the echo of that strange invitation. Shadow padded to his side, pressing against his leg. Ethan glanced at the dog and murmured, half to himself, "What the hell did we just walk into, buddy?" Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, steady, endless, as if the sky itself were keeping their secret. The next morning, the world was still wrapped in frost when Ethan Cole returned to the towering glass fortress of Kane Holdings. The air inside was warm, scented faintly with cologne and ambition. Richard Kane was already waiting for him near the elevator, dressed in a gray three-piece suit, sharp as a blade even at dawn. There was something in the billionaire's composure, the quiet weight of command, mixed with fatigue that success could never cure. "Morning, Mr. Cole," Kane greeted, voice calm but firm. "Come with me. There's someone I want you to meet." They walked down a marble corridor until Kane stopped in front of a door labeled Security Operations. Inside stood Marcus Hale, a man in his mid-40s with the build of a linebacker and a face cut from stone. His hair was dark and slicked back, but gray streaks framed his temples like war scars. His jaw was square, his eyes narrow. The kind of man who'd spent his life not trusting anyone until they earned it, and even then, barely. "Marcus," Kane said, "this is Ethan Cole, former Navy SEAL. He's the one who returned my briefcase." Marcus's handshake was firm but short, his expression unreadable. "SEAL, huh? Guess that explains the posture," he said dryly, eyeing Ethan's stance. "We'll see if the discipline matches the resume." Kane gave him a look that ended the test before it started. "You'll brief him on his duties. Ethan will be my personal security detail. I trust your full cooperation." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Understood, sir." But his tone carried the subtle weight of challenge, one soldier quietly sizing up another. By that afternoon, Ethan and Shadow were escorted to Kane's private estate, a sprawling glass and stone residence built on the frozen edge of Lake Madison, 20 miles outside the city. The place looked more like a fortress than a home. High walls, surveillance towers, a silent army of staff that never smiled. Kane's driver stopped at the gate. "Welcome to the house money built," he said with a half-smirk, before leaving them at the front steps. Inside, warmth and wealth clashed with emptiness. Polished wood floors reflected the firelight from a grand stone hearth. Paintings worth millions hung over cold walls that felt untouched by laughter. Ethan could feel the silence. Heavy, respectful, lonely. Kane appeared from the study, his voice echoing through the hall. "That's Shadow, I assume?" Ethan nodded. The German shepherd stood alert, his sable coat shining under the chandelier. Kane bent slightly, not close enough to touch. "If he doesn't bite, he can stay." He smiled faintly. "But if he does, make sure it's only when I deserve it." It was the first time Ethan had seen him joke. Days turned into weeks. Ethan's life fell into rhythm. Early mornings securing perimeters, quiet afternoons in the study, long nights ensuring the house remained untouched by the outside world. Kane's schedule was precise, almost ritualistic. He'd spend hours by the fireplace with a glass of bourbon, staring at a framed photograph on the mantel. A woman with soft eyes and a boy no older than 10. His wife and son, Ethan learned later, had died in a car crash 8 years ago. The rumor whispered through the staff was that Kane had been on a business call when it happened. Since then, the billionaire never remarried, never left Montana in winter, and never smiled without effort. Sometimes, Ethan would walk past the living room and see him there, not as a titan of industry, but as a man haunted by a moment that wouldn't fade. It wasn't long before Kane began to speak to him, not as an employee, but as someone who understood loss. One evening, as the fire crackled softly, Kane sat in his leather armchair, Shadow resting by his feet, head on Kane's polished shoe. The billionaire glanced down and chuckled. "He's loyal," Kane said. "Loyalty's rare these days. Maybe that's why I trust him more than half the people I pay." Ethan smiled faintly. "Dogs don't care about your money, sir. Just your scent." Kane looked at him, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Then maybe that's what I've been missing. People who smell truth instead of profit." From that night on, their conversations grew longer, sometimes about war, sometimes about silence, sometimes about how both men had seen what the world did to kindness. Kane had built empires to hide his grief. Ethan had built walls to protect his guilt. And somewhere in between, they recognized each other's loneliness. Still, Ethan's nights ended the same way, He'd call his mother, pretending her voice didn't sound weaker each day. "I'm fine, Ma." He'd lie softly. "The new job's good. There's heat here. You'd like it." She'd laugh gently, her voice trembling, and tell him to take care of the dog. When the line went silent, Ethan would sit by the window, staring out at the lake, frozen, endless, and calm. He didn't know if this job was redemption or just another uniform. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man drifting. Somewhere in the hollow quiet of that mansion, he'd found a reason to keep standing. The night settled heavy over Lake Madison, the kind of cold that numbed the bones and silenced the world. The estate was still, its lights glowing faintly against the falling snow. Inside the mansion, Ethan Cole sat near the fire, cleaning his sidearm, a habit that never left him since his military days. Shadow lay beside him, eyes half closed but ears alert, every flicker of movement reflected in his amber gaze. For weeks, things had felt almost calm. Kane had grown to trust Ethan more than anyone else in the house. Too much, perhaps. Ethan could sense Marcus Hale's quiet resentment growing like frost behind glass. The head of security had started avoiding eye contact, muttering clipped answers, and spending long hours alone in the control room. There was something guarded in his movements, something wrong in the way his hand lingered over the security feeds. Ethan had seen that look before, in soldiers who'd already decided to cross the line. That night, as the clock struck past midnight, Shadow's head lifted sharply. The dog let out a low growl, deep and warning. Ethan froze, listening. The wind howled outside, but beneath it, a faint metallic click echoed down the hall. Ethan stood, gun at his side, following Shadow down the corridor. The sound led to the data storage wing, a secure room that held encrypted drives and confidential files, accessible only to Kane and Marcus. The lights flickered. Ethan's boots left shallow prints in the carpet as he approached the door. Inside, through the narrow glass panel, he saw Marcus Hale. The man was hunched over the central server rack, his large frame outlined by the cold blue light of the monitors. In his hand gleamed a USB drive, and on his face, guilt, panic, and something darker, desperation. "Marcus," Ethan called, voice low but steady. "Step away from the terminal." Marcus spun around, startled. His eyes flashed with fury. "You shouldn't be here, Cole." "Neither should you," Ethan replied, keeping his weapon lowered. "What are you doing?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Saving what's left of me. You think loyalty pays bills? I gave this company my life, and Kane replaced me with a charity case and his dog." He pocketed the USB and moved toward the door. Ethan blocked the way. "That's not the way to fix it." "Move," Marcus hissed. Ethan shook his head slowly. "You know I can't." The next moment came like lightning. Marcus drew his gun and fired. The shot cracked through the hall. Ethan staggered back as pain ripped through his shoulder, warm blood soaking into his sleeve. Shadow barked furiously, teeth bared, ready to lunge. Marcus bolted out the back door, disappearing into the white storm. Ethan leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "Shadow, go," he commanded. The dog darted into the snow, vanishing into the blizzard. The storm howled around them, flakes slicing through the darkness like shards of glass. Ethan stumbled outside, following Shadow's barking through the forest path. His vision blurred, but his instincts guided him, the rhythm of survival etched deep into his bones. He found them near the cliff's edge, the lake frozen below like a mirror of the night sky. Marcus stood cornered, the wind tearing at his coat. the USB clutched in his shaking hand. Shadow growled, crouched low between the men, eyes locked on the traitor. "Don't make me do this!" Ethan shouted over the wind. Marcus's voice cracked, a strange mix of rage and regret. "You don't understand. I had nothing left. He gave you everything that should have been mine." Ethan took a slow step forward, blood dripping into the snow. "I didn't take anything from you, Marcus. You lost it the day you stopped believing in who you were." Marcus raised his gun, but his footing slipped. The ice beneath him cracked, groaned, and then gave way. "Marcus!" Ethan lunged forward. The man's body dropped toward the edge, his fingers catching a jagged rock just in time. His legs dangled over the abyss, eyes wide with terror. For a heartbeat, the world went silent except for the storm's scream. Ethan hesitated only a second, then reached down, gripping Marcus's arm. The pain in his own shoulder flared, blood soaking through his jacket, but he pulled anyway. "Hold on," Marcus gasped. Why would you save me?" Ethan's voice strained through the wind. "Because I've seen enough men die. It's harder to keep someone alive." With a final heave, he dragged Marcus up onto the snow. The older man collapsed, shaking, staring at the hand that had saved him, the same man he'd tried to kill. Moments later, headlights cut through the storm. Kane's SUV stopped nearby, and the billionaire stepped out, coat whipping in the wind. His eyes took in the scene. Ethan's bleeding shoulder, Marcus trembling on the ground, Shadow standing guard with snow on his muzzle. Kane's voice was quiet but heavy. "You could have let him fall." Ethan looked up, exhausted but calm. "I could have. But then I'd be no better than him." For a long time, Kane said nothing. Then, in a voice that carried both guilt and admiration, he whispered, "You didn't just protect me tonight, Ethan. You protected the part of me that still believes in good men." The wind eased, the snow slowed, and for the first time in years, Richard Kane looked like a man who'd remembered what humanity felt like. The snow had begun to melt in Bozeman, dripping from rooftops and branches like the slow thaw of grief. Winter was leaving, and with it, the storm that had nearly broken them all. For Richard Kane, the past weeks had been a reckoning, a time to measure the weight of wealth against the worth of character. Every night since that blizzard, he had replayed Ethan's words. "It's harder to keep someone alive." They lingered in him, quiet and sharp, like a prayer he didn't know he'd been waiting to hear. At the hospital overlooking the Yellowstone foothills, Margaret Cole lay by the window, her frail frame wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Once a strong woman who'd raised her son alone, she now looked like a shadow of the mother Ethan remembered, yet her eyes still held that stubborn spark of kindness that had shaped him. The chemo had taken her strength, but not her dignity. That morning, the door opened softly. Richard Kane stepped inside, his expensive coat folded neatly over one arm. Gone was the coldness that had once defined him. The man who had once spoken only in contracts and numbers now moved like someone trying to make peace with his own soul. He stood by the bed for a long moment, unsure if words could carry the weight of what he felt. "Mr. Kane," Margaret said weakly, her voice gentle but firm. "You didn't have to come." He smiled faintly. "I did, because your son reminded me what I used to stand for." She tilted her head, curious, studying the billionaire who looked more like a weary father than a man of power. "Ethan's a good boy. Always has been." Kane's voice softened. "He is more than good, Mrs. Cole. He's honest." And in this world, that's rarer than gold. He set a folder on the bedside table, discreet but unmistakable. Inside were hospital invoices marked "paid in full." Margaret's fingers trembled as she touched it. "I can't accept charity," she whispered. "This isn't charity," Kane replied quietly. "It's an investment in the man who kept his promise when he could have broken it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "Then it's the best investment you'll ever make." Outside the room, Ethan stood silently, watching through the glass. He hadn't known Kane would come, or what he planned to do. Seeing the older man speaking softly to his mother, seeing the light in her tired eyes, it undid something in him. Not pity, not gratitude, but a quiet reconciliation between the soldier he'd been and the man he was trying to become. Weeks later, the mansion by the lake was no longer silent. The fire burned warmer. The halls echoed with life again. Ethan still wore his security badge, but Kane had started introducing him differently. "This is Ethan Cole, my right hand," he'd say, or sometimes simply, "my family." Shadow followed him everywhere, older now, his muzzle dusted with gray, but his loyalty as fierce as ever. Ethan often worked, late, long after Kane had gone to bed. Sometimes he'd stand by the tall glass windows, looking out at the thawing lake, his reflection merging with the stars. He thought of the black briefcase, of the weight it carried, not just in money, but in choices. One evening, he took a weekend off and drove back to the small cabin outside town. Margaret was there, sitting by the window, the same one she used to wait by when he was deployed overseas. The room smelled faintly of pine and the lemon soap she liked. Shadow trotted in first, tail wagging, nose pressed to her knee. Ethan sat beside her, taking her frail hand in both of his. She smiled faintly, tracing the faint scar still visible on his shoulder. "You've seen too much, my boy. Enough to know what matters," he said softly. Margaret looked out at the snowflakes beginning to fall again. The last of the season. "Tell me something," she whispered. "Do you ever regret it? Not keeping that money?" Ethan paused, his gaze distant, thoughtful. Then a small, weary smile touched his lips. "No, Mom. I still kept it. It's just not in my hands anymore. It's in here." He pressed her hand gently against his chest. She closed her eyes, a peaceful sigh escaping her lips. "Then I suppose I raised you right." The camera would pull back then. The small cabin bathed in soft winter light, a son holding his mother's hand, a loyal dog resting by their feet. Beyond the window, snow drifted lazily across the fading light of Montana's sky. A voiceover would fade in, gentle but certain. "In a world where lines blur and values fade, integrity remains the one thing that never loses its worth, even when everything else is gone." And as the screen dimmed to black, one final line appeared. "Integrity isn't what you say when life is easy. It's what you do when no one is watching." Sometimes, miracles don't arrive in thunder or light. They come quietly, wrapped in small acts of honesty. When Ethan returned that briefcase, he didn't just save a billionaire's soul. He reminded the world that integrity is God's way of whispering, "I still believe in you." Because every time we choose what's right when no one's watching, heaven takes notice. And maybe that's the real miracle. Not money, not luck, but the quiet strength to stay good in a world that tempts you otherwise. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes goodness matters. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and one moment when you chose honesty over comfort. And if you believe that God still rewards those who walk the narrow path, tap subscribe so His light may reach more hearts. May God bless you and everyone who still believes in the power of truth, loyalty, and love.